So good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, like Chrissy said, my name is Joey Balfour, and I am the Curator of Oral History at the National World War II Museum. As Curator of Oral History, I am responsible for conducting interviews as well as preserving them and improving access to the interviews in our collection, which is something that I will touch on a little bit later on. Um, this morning, I will be doing an interview of sorts with my guest about a specific period of time experienced by a well-known unit that many of you are likely familiar with, and that's the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. As many of you know, the 442nd fought with distinction in Italy and southern France in 44 and 45, including the rescue of the elements of the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry, the famous Lost Battalion in the Vosges Mountains in October 1944. The 442nd suffered a tremendously high casualty rate while earning the distinction of being the highest decorated unit of its size in the Army. But before they squared off against Axis troops in the Italian mainland and in southern France, the Nisei, or first generation Japanese Americans of the 442nd, trained at a base just an hour or an hour and a half east of where I'm sitting right now in New Orleans, and that's at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. For those of you who are not familiar with Camp Shelby, the base lies roughly 10 or 15 miles south of Hattiesburg. Now, whether it was Japanese Americans training at Camp Shelby, African Americans training at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, Caucasians training at Camp Walters, Texas, the training itself was fairly similar. What was different was the way that the individuals were treated, not just by their fellow servicemen, but by their officers and NCOs, as well as the civilians that lived in the cities, towns, villages nearby. And this is a topic that's long been of interest to me, and I figured if it was of interest to me, it'd be of interest to others. So when my guest agreed to join me to answer some questions about the 442nd at Camp Shelby, I was pretty happy. And that brings me to my guest this morning. With me here today is a former colleague and a very dear friend of mine, Tommy Lofton. As Chrissy said, Tommy is the director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum located on base at Camp Shelby. And I couldn't think of anybody better to discuss this topic with. So, Tommy, thank you for joining me today. It's really good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Before we get started, how are things out at the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum, and is there anything you'd like the public to know about the museum?
Sure. Right now, things at the museum are a little slow, just as with the National World War II Museum because of all this COVID mess, if you will. But we'll get through this, I have no doubt. The museum itself, just to give a little background on that, it actually opened in 2001, and we are designed to be the state's official museum for military history. And actually, our exhibits focus primarily on Mississippians, native Mississippians, or folks who came to Mississippi and settled and maybe passed away and are buried here. And we also focus on units like the 442 who came to Mississippi, trained, and then went on to perform great deeds in combat. And so our exhibits actually focus on the War of 1812 through the modern and global war zone terror. So we cover quite a large range of warfare in between those time periods. I think our biggest exhibits are probably World War I, World War II, and then especially Vietnam, because of the sheer size of those wars and what Camp Shelby was doing at that time, and other parts of Mississippi. And we're also funded through the Mississippi Military Department, so we're part of the Air National Guard and the Army National Guard, and work hand in hand with those guys in trying to commemorate their service and honor their memory and their involvement in all these wars and campaigns over time, and also honor all military retirees from all service branches and all these wars. Other quick plug for the museum itself, we are on social media, obviously. And we're actually free and open to the public on Tuesday through Saturday when we're open from 8 o'clock to 4 o'clock. And all you have to do is show a valid driver's license at the guard gates there. You do have to come through a guard gate at Shelby, but show your valid driver's license, and they can get you directions into the museum or follow some of the signage. And you can come visit us anytime you want to, Tuesday through Saturday from 9 to 4, once all this Corona mess is over with.
All right. Well, if you're ready to get started, when and how did the 442nd end up at Camp Shelby?
Sure. Yeah, we can start with that one. I guess the easiest thing to back up, obviously, Pearl Harbor's attacked. Japanese Americans, or for many years, have been immigrating to Hawaiian Islands and to the West Coast and into the United States. So really the story of the 442, you got to start with the story of the 100th Infantry Battalion, which was largely a Hawaiian provisional battalion of Hawaiian National Guard members who were in service, most of them, when the war started or shortly after. And so in May of 1942, the 100th Battalion actually was formed, and then by June, they were in Oakland, California, heading to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, to do most of their training. And that's, that's crazy for us to think about in a sense, but especially in the 1940s, most of these folks had never left Hawaii. And so to go all the way across the ocean into California and then go all the way to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, that's a whole different world for a lot of these men. They get up there and start training in the summer of 1942, and they actually spend several months there into the winter of early 43, and for many of them, it was the first time they ever even saw snow. And so there's actually some great footage and photographs out there of these guys running around like, little kids in the snow, because it was the first time they had ever seen that kind of thing. And once they get to Camp McCoy, they're assigned to the Second Army, and most of these guys actually went through some superb training. And I think they had a lot to prove of themselves as well, much like other minorities, if you will, in the war, like the African Americans. I think the Japanese Americans wanted to show, we're not native Japanese, we're first or second generation Americans, and we bleed red, white, and blue. And, they wanted to prove themselves. And so they did everything they could to gain the respect of local townspeople in the area of Camp McCoy. And they actually got some awards and recognition for good conduct in the area, for good conduct when they were in town. And there's actually a record that a few of them, I don't remember the exact number, actually saved some local townspeople in the wintertime when the lakes were freezing over. They actually had some folks who were about to drown, and they stepped in and saved their lives. So there was already acts of heroism occurring before they even get into combat. During this time as well, the Army went through some interesting training and decided to send about 25 enlisted men and 3 or 4 officers down from Camp McCoy to Mississippi. And this was to go to a place called Cat Island off the coast of Mississippi. Initially to Ship Island, and then they moved them over to Cat Island. And we can talk a little bit more about that training in a minute, but there was some involvement already with Mississippi and Japanese Americans at that point, before the 442 was even really at Camp Shelby or established hardcore. And then also the government started setting up military language schools. And they realized that some of these soldiers who were at Camp McCoy could speak Japanese, and this could be beneficial to intelligence or interrogation work that was going on or would be going on in the Pacific. So some of these guys are actually pulled out of the 100th Battalion and taken to other language schools around the country for other specialized training, and some of them never rejoined their unit and were actually sent, again, overseas to the Pacific. February 1943, the 100th Battalion is actually transferred from Camp McCoy to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, again, just south of Hattiesburg here. And at that time, just so you know, Camp Shelby's history, it was actually a World War I training site, and then sort of closed down. There was still some light training, if you will, post-World War I, but really during the interwar period, there wasn't a whole lot going on out there. When World War II kicked off, a large amount of construction, and it was actually considered the second, one of the largest, but actually the second largest, I believe, training base in the United States. And it basically covered, technically, from Hattiesburg all the way down to the Gulf Coast, if you want to get real technical. So massive training areas, and it was ideal because you had so many different units you could bring into one place to train for different types of warfare, depending on where you were going to send them as the government. So 100th Battalion sent down to Camp Shelby. Initially, they were attached to the 69th Infantry Division here. And then by April 1943, they were actually sent to the Louisiana maneuvers and sent to Camp Claiborne for a limited basis there, which, of course, Camp Claiborne was just before this, the home of the airborne, where the 82nd Division became the 82nd Airborne Division and really started their history at the beginning of the war. So then, again, February 1943, 100th Battalion heads to Camp Shelby. At the same exact time, the U.S. government activated the 442, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And at this time, most of their officers were Caucasian. So other than those officers, the unit was almost entirely Japanese American. And it was actually a mixture of folks from the Hawaiian Islands and from the West Coast. So you had sort of a melting pot, if you will, of Japanese Americans. And so by May of 1943, there were about 1,500 volunteers from the mainland U.S., and then about 3,000 volunteers from Hawaii that assembled here at Camp Shelby. When they actually got here, they were classified by the government as 4C, which is enemy alien. Something not usual for most soldiers who were serving in World War II for the United States. And at some point that actually changed, but yeah, early on they were considered enemy aliens, and many of them, especially the mainlanders, had come out of internment camps or had enlisted as their families were getting pulled into internment camps along the West Coast and spread across the Midwest and even into Arkansas because of Executive Order 9066. So there was that going on. And I guess I'll just let you ask your next question.
Well, when all of these, when these Japanese Americans start heading down to Camp Shelby, how did the local citizens living in the area around the base feel about this influx of Japanese Americans to their area?
Oh yeah. So as you can imagine, from talking to some of the members of the 442 over the years, there was a little bit of a nervous feeling in coming to Mississippi because they were very well aware of segregation, Jim Crow, and everything with the South. So they didn't exactly know how they were going to be treated. If it was going to be that they were well received, if it was going to be that they looked like our enemy in the Pacific, and so they were going to be shunned or be threatened or potentially killed. So there was some nervous feelings about coming here to train, and thankfully that got a little bit better as they got to Mississippi. The local community actually stepped up and decided to, actually General Halloran, who was the commander, if you will, of the base at Camp Shelby, or the post, General Halloran actually stepped up with all the local civic leaders, with the state government, and with any political leaders that he knew had some pull, and really pushed for these guys to be well received and received as in the same level, if you will, as Caucasians. So they weren't, there's still stories of some guys dealing with some issues of segregation or some people who felt negatively toward them. But by and large, their experience got better, especially the longer they stayed here and the more that they became well known in the community. There's actually a few happy stories, if I can go into those, as they got into Camp Shelby and got to be familiar with Hattiesburg and with the people here. One story in particular that I love, one of our founding members actually of our museum's board, and that was a long time supporter of our board, was a gentleman named Herbert Sasaki. And he actually met his wife at Camp Shelby and married her here. At the time, she was from Purvis, just outside of the Hattiesburg area, just south of there. Marriage laws in Mississippi, of course, being a segregated state, were very tense. There was a lot of question as to if their marriage would be accepted or legal or whatever. But thankfully, the government, because they started recognizing Japanese Americans as Caucasians more so than African Americans, they actually determined that it was not illegal for them to get married. And so they did. And then after the war, he actually returned here to Hattiesburg and settled and became a successful businessman here, if you will, or a successful gentleman, raised a family, and a lot of his family's still around here. In fact, there's just found out there's a big butcher shop here in town, the Wool Butcher Shop in Hattiesburg, and I just found out they're actually related to nieces and nephews of Mr. Sasaki. And so all that stuff wouldn't have come about had it not been for his training here and his being sent here with the 442, and then going overseas with them and surviving the war. Another interesting story is a gentleman, local businessman named Earl Finch, and he was actually a native of the area. He was very prominent figure here in town and was very prominent in making sure that the Japanese Americans arrived here and stayed here feeling very welcome. And he sort of took it upon his mission, if you will. His mission became, he took it upon himself to make it his mission to extend dinner invitations to some of these soldiers and have them come to his home, encourage some of the local community, especially on Sundays after church. A lot of people went to church and had big Sunday meals at lunch or dinner. Have some of these soldiers from Camp Shelby, including the 442, come into your home and serve some of them. Mr. Finch actually bought a local ranch, I think it's like 350 acres or so, and actually turned it into a gathering place for the Japanese Americans to come out and hang out. He apparently was able to get and import Japanese and Hawaiian foods to the site to make them feel a little bit more welcome. And he supported athletic teams of theirs. They had baseball teams and sports teams here at Camp Shelby as well that would compete, all in fun. And so he was very instrumental in making sure that they were a part of the local community in a sense, even though they were out at Camp Shelby in training. He also designed a USO here in town that was, I think, dubbed the Aloha USO. And it lasted for a few months until it became more apparent that Japanese Americans could actually go into the white officers' locations and other USO clubs, and so they could intermingle a little more. But he did actually go to the steps of trying to create a USO to make them feel more welcome. There was actually an African American USO, which still exists in downtown Hattiesburg, and they have their own museum. That's quite remarkable. So if you get to the Hattiesburg area, be sure and check that out as well. It's still in the original USO building. I think it's the only existing World War II African American USO in the country that's still standing. So you already had multiple USOs, and it was important for Mr. Finch and for others to establish this USO here locally. There's something unique about him too, in that he didn't just keep all of this restricted to Hattiesburg and the Camp Shelby. As he found out about some of these Japanese Americans that he met, or the ones he didn't even get to know, as they came back to the United States and were in hospitals because of their war injuries and things, he would travel around the country, even with rationing and everything else going on, and actually visit them and take time to go see them in the hospitals, or if they came back here to Shelby, try to visit them, make them feel welcome again, comfort them, do whatever he needed to do to try to lift their spirits. And he actually formed a performance group called the Shelby Serenaders to go out and perform for them as well. And after the war, just to tell you how much of an impact this gentleman was on the 442 and the Japanese Americans here that trained, he actually went to Hawaii to visit post-war and was basically given a hero's welcome when he was received. And the Hawaiian folks from the 100th Battalion and some of those that were in the 442 actually wrote a song for him called the Earl Finch Hula. And I tried to find some music for it, but I couldn't come across it right now, nor would I try to sing it even if I knew what it was. But yeah, so there's a song out there called the Earl Finch Hula for this guy from Hattiesburg, Mississippi, who did everything he could to make them feel more welcome and not feel like they're enemy aliens any longer, as best he could.
You mentioned that a lot of the locals actually took these Japanese American soldiers into their homes. Kate, if you could put up image number 2 for us. As all of us down here in the South know, Sunday dinner, the next one, please. There you go. Sunday dinner here in the South is a big deal. So having these guys, the other image that you had up just now, the guys eating, it's having these guys into the locals' houses would have been a big deal for people. So that is certainly something amazing, especially when you think of how typically closed-minded people were down here at that time during segregation in the 1940s.
Well, you got to remember too, there were farms all over this area at that time, and so there was also plenty of food to go around, and a lot less people around here to eat it because a lot of folks were getting drafted and sent off to war and sent all over the country. So I think in some sense it was nice for families who had family members that were now off at other training bases to finally have other soldiers, not really caring what they looked like or where they were from, able to sit down and eat a meal, and kind of share a little commonality in such a dark time in our country's history.
Now, what was the relationship between the two different groups of Japanese Americans in the 442nd? They're the mainlanders and the guys from Hawaii. What was that relationship like?
So at first, it was pretty rough. There was a lot of, what do you call it, rivalry, sort of a sibling rivalry of a sense. The Hawaiian Islanders typically saw the mainlanders as sort of stuck up. They reminded them of the folks who owned the plantations and things out in Hawaii, plantation owners, if you will. They kind of saw them as a different class of citizens, even though they all looked the same, if you will. So they kind of clashed culturally. They didn't exactly get along. They didn't even speak the same language, really. I mean, the Hawaiian Islanders were used to speaking pidgin and had a whole different type of music, a whole different way of life. So there was a lot of tension at first. But thankfully, their commanding officers, and I think their chaplain and General Halloran actually came up with the idea when some of this was getting pretty tense early on. They said, we need to do something about this. Clearly, we've got to have this as a cohesive force, or this is never going to work. The Army is going to, suspend any of this kind of training potentially, or bust up this unit, and we're going to be back at square one with potentially with Japanese-American relations in this country. So there were two, if I remember correctly, Japanese internment camps in Arkansas, and they actually bussed those guys or trucked them up in military convoy. That were the ones from Hawaii, I should say. They actually loaded them up in vehicles and drove them to Arkansas. And it's my understanding the whole way up there, they were singing and playing ukuleles and having a good old time, thinking, hey, we're getting away from Camp Shelby, we're getting to go on a field trip. Kind of think about your days as a youth. Anytime you get to leave the classroom and go on a field trip, it was an adventure. And everything was fun and games until they pulled into the gates of these internment camps, and they saw the machine guns pointing in, they saw the barbed wire, and they saw people who looked like them coming out of these tar paper shack barracks. And they realized some of these people had put, I think, a week's worth of their rations away to offer up food and beverages and things to these soldiers and make them feel welcome, and kind of threw them a welcome party. And it's my understanding that helped the Hawaiian members of the unit to understand where these folks, especially from the West Coast, were coming from, with their families in internment camps scattered all over the country. Their homes had been taken and possessions had been taken away from them. And they developed a newfound respect for their colleagues, if you will, or their fellow soldiers in the unit. And so it's my understanding that the entire drive back to Camp Shelby was a much quieter journey back. There was not as much celebration or field trip excitement, if you will. And I think that action alone was probably one of the smartest things that could have happened for that unit and in the war, to build camaraderie and to build a strong unit where you can trust that person next to you on either side of you, no matter if they're from Hawaii or from, I don't know, Los Angeles or wherever. At that point, the rivalry went away, and they were now taking more pride as a unit. They also had developed a unique patch. And the 100th Battalion guys were still able to wear their original patches if they wanted to, is my understanding. And they still had a sense of their own pride, of course, but they were much more accepting of the 442 mixture as well as they were mixed in. but they developed this beautiful patch that has actually a hand holding a sword, and it's got red, white, and silver in there, or red, white, and blue, if you will. And it's pretty common. It's probably one of the most well-known patches of World War II. Believe it or not, the first rendition was not very pretty, and actually was a yellow hand holding a red sword, if I remember correctly, which didn't go over too well. So thankfully, a soldier actually redesigned it to make it something much more patriotic, something that actually better represented their unit and showed them to be the proud Americans that they were. And, it was less about the Japanese heritage and more about the fact that they bled red, white, and blue.
And also the intense training they did. Kate, if you could put up image number 1, please. The training they did would have also occupied quite a bit of their time and not allowed them to have that rivalry. When you're training nonstop, you tend to get kind of tired and not feel like dealing with that later on in the day. But speaking of training, it was something you touched on earlier that I wanted to ask you about. It was something I had heard of years ago. Was there any unique training or experiments conducted with these Japanese Americans strictly because of their race?
Sure. So yeah, I mentioned Cat Island earlier, and I'm glad you circled back to that. So again, 100th Battalion leaves Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, heads down to Camp Camp Shelby. But before that, or as they're getting ready to do that, they send, again, I think it was 25 soldiers or enlisted men and about 3 or 4 officers down to Ship Island, and they're carried over to Cat Island, where the U.S. Army had taken, it was an experiment. They had taken local donated pets, dogs, put them out on this island, and their goal was to try to see, long story short, to try to see if they could detect something different about these Japanese Americans, so that if they take 4 dogs to the Pacific, can they search for Japanese? Can they smell the Japanese? Is there something different about their makeup or their DNA or genetics or whatever that may make them stand out in such a way that could be beneficial? It didn't work. Let's be honest. And it was something that was actually kept secret for many years. And a lot of people obviously have problems with it, or had problems with it when the news came out. But it was something that it was an experiment. It didn't work, and part of that was due to the diet as well. When they realized that our Japanese American soldiers were eating the same meals as Caucasians and African Americans and everybody else, it was very different from Japanese soldiers who were serving in the Pacific and eating a much different diet, a much more fish-based diet, if you will. So yeah, so there's some interesting things if you get time, and there's a whole other talk you can do on Cat Island and other training and things like that around the country for sure. But I definitely urge people to go and look into that story a little bit, because it is something kind of unique to think about. I think actually I had a great uncle who may have even been involved in some of that. Yeah, it didn't work, but it is something unique to the Japanese Americans and their training experience in the U.S. before going overseas.
Now, when did the 442nd leave Shelby to deploy overseas?
So, I mentioned earlier the 100th Battalion came in first, attached to the 442, and then they actually left before the 442. They first went to combat in August 43, went from Camp Shelby to Camp Kilmer, and then they made their way overseas and were attached to the 34th Infantry Division, the Red Bull Division, and they actually entered in Oran, North Africa. They were first sent there, trained there, got to link up with the 34th Division, and then they actually started serving with quite a bit of distinction themselves, but taking heavy casualties. There were still some elements of the 100th Battalion that were left behind at Camp Shelby to help feed replacements to the Japanese Americans that were in the 100th Battalion overseas. And that was to keep this unit as an all Japanese American unit. That was something unique. They weren't just sending people from all over the country in replacement depots there. It specifically was Japanese soldiers or Japanese American soldiers that were coming primarily from Camp Shelby. And then the 442 itself actually was sent over as the 100th Battalion worked their way up to Anzio, Salerno, and up to Rome. the 442 ended up actually joining them in June 1944 overseas in the Anzio area, and then they entered together in combat around Rome and moved forward from there. And then, if you will, the rest of their story takes off into a whole other direction of where they served admirably and heroically.
And how did the local community around Shelby react to that deployment? You have these guys who've been there. Some have been there for a couple of years at this point, or close to it. The community has come to love these guys. They bring them into their homes for Sunday dinner. How does the community react when they leave?
Some of the people I've talked to over the years, especially that were inviting into these members of the 442 into their homes, they were quite sad. They got to know these folks. They got to learn about their culture or their backgrounds. Especially if they were from Hawaii. Folks, just like folks from Hawaii had never been to Mississippi, people from Mississippi had not been to Hawaii unless they had been in the service, the Navy or the Marines or the Army, sent out there and stationed out there at some point. I do know there's some stories of folks who still were a little bitter about them being around here. I did find a few accounts of some of those because they were folks who had sons who were lost or missing in the Pacific. So there wasn't, I'm not going to say everybody was 100% on board with them, but yeah, a lot of people were still very upset or very sad to see them go, but they also knew there was a war to fight. And you got to remember too, there was also still a lot of other troops coming in to train, a lot of turnover. So as soon as the core of the 442 is going, you have other units who are coming into Shelby, and the goal was to keep them welcome as well. And there was still cadre and folks left behind from the 442 and the 100th Battalion here doing training, medical training, and other things as well. And we can talk about some of the other training they were doing here at Shelby if you want to a little bit, but that was something that was still continuing for a good portion of the war. Again, just to be able to keep feeding soldiers to be replacements and to help continue the unit as it moves through some hellacious combat in the Mediterranean and into Europe.
And is there any relationship between the veterans of the 442nd and the citizens of Hattiesburg today?
Yeah, well, sadly, most of the 442 veterans are gone. I will say in the 90s, they actually had a major reunion here at Camp Shelby, and apparently hundreds of members of the 442 and 100th Battalion came. It was a massive thing. Anybody who was at Shelby today, who was there at that time, still remembers it with a great bit of fondness. And I think there is still a lot of respect for the 442 in this area. I can see it in our museum all the time. Of course, we take great pride in them. We even have a photo of them in our lobby when they're standing in formation. As you come in the front door, and it's a mixture of photos, different periods from different wars. But that's one of our World War II photos, if you will, that we take great pride in. And I've had soldiers, Marines, folks from other countries, even whether civilians or military folks training here at Shelby, come in and want to see what do you have on the 442, or what do you have on these Japanese Americans. It's amazing, you never think about it, but some of them have heard of these guys and know of their lineage and of their service and their combat history. And when they find out they were trained at Shelby, and that Camp Shelby and Hattiesburg consider this another home for these Japanese Americans, and they seem to feel that way mutually. I think it's kind of cool for us to see that that's still such an impact 75 years later on folks and younger generations who have no connection any longer to the 442, because again, most of their veterans sadly have passed away. To that point, I think it was interesting for the 442 to actually get to go around and see some of their old training areas too. And these guys were doing some pretty amazing stuff. There were actually, I think, 2 newsreels that were made out here during the war. One was in color, and it showed some of the Japanese training. It gave also people in town here who didn't go out, they would see them on the weekends or they'd see them around, but they didn't know exactly what kind of training was going on in Shelby. So they got to see these Japanese Americans come in and doing everything from their basic training to, they had artillery units that were firing 105 millimeter howitzers. They had medical training going on. I think they had anti-tank guns, bazookas, all the major weapons training you think of, nighttime maneuvers, daytime maneuvers, combat engineer training, learning how to build bridges and how to ford streams and rivers. including the Leaf River here in town. Learning these bulldozers and all this other kind of equipment that they could, see themselves using in combat. So when they left Camp Shelby, they were a fully effective fighting force that was ready to do some damage to the enemy and to bring about an end to this war. So it's impressive to see what they did here. Again, a lot of people still have a lot of pride from this area, especially what these soldiers did, what they went through. Also knowing now, especially what they were going through before they got here, and now that we've become a country that's much more open and free to talking about the internment camps, or as some even call them, concentration camps. It's a significant impact on a lot of the local population and folks around the country as well.
And I think that's a good spot for us to wrap this presentation up. If anybody has any questions, we'll certainly try to address some of them. Let's see if I can. So Jeff O2 is asking, I know nothing about this base. Can you recommend a source? Thank you. Tommy, can you address that?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a bit out there on Camp Shelby. I think it just depends on what you're looking for. If it's, to know what's going on right now with training. I mean, there's information out there online. Our public affairs folks are putting stuff out on social media. Camp Shelby actually has its own Facebook page that you can actually get on and see what's going on. Today, it's a joint force training site with, I think, 136,000 acres. It's the largest National Guard training site in the United States. And frankly, one of the most impressive and largest training sites of not just National Guard, but all military. We've got active duty units training here, Marines, Special Forces, Navy Seabees, Air Force. It legitimately is a joint force training site, and it's amazing to see, little old Camp Shelby, if you will, is still playing such a major role, and probably one of the most important roles in the United States in training men and women for everything that they could potentially face in combat or on the home front in modern days. There are quite a few books out on the 442 as well, divisional histories and other things. There's a few histories that have been written about Camp Shelby or about the Hattiesburg area locally. I think you get most of those on Amazon. And I would urge folks to look at Camp Shelby's website and contact our public affairs folks too if they want some more information, especially as to what's going on today with Camp Shelby. And I don't know if there's any family members of, say, 442 folks watching, but just know too that, again, we take great pride in that unit and all the units that train here, and we're trying to constantly put out stuff. The museum has its own Facebook and Instagram accounts, and we're trying to, especially right now with being closed, put some information out there about some of these units and training that was going on over time, again, from World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and all different time periods. So that is probably the best way I can think to answer some of that.
William says, my mother-in-law was a nurse at Camp McCain. Do you have any information on nurses at Camp McCain and Camp Shelby?
We have a little bit. I'd have to look and see what's in our archive, actually. I don't know. It would kind of depend too on where his grandmother was at, as far as what, was she in a civilian capacity or in a military capacity? What, if she was in the military, what unit was she assigned to? I could possibly get some more information, just depending on what he's looking for. I would urge, I think you said it was William, to reach out on the museum's website and either send myself an email or send one to the general account or the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum, and we can do what we can to try to help him answer that. But yeah, I mean, we do have information on Camp McCain, and that's something that's, even though we're at Camp Shelby physically, it's our goal now and into the future to be able to tell the stories of Camp McCain, of Keesler Air Force Base, and talk about the field in Meridian. And, there was a number of other air bases, Columbus Air Force Base, and other, there was a Merchant Marine Academy training site on the coast back during World War II, and the naval training. Of course, Ingalls Shipyard has played a major role a lot in our warfare in the country. So, yes, we do cover that kind of stuff and try to do more of that even in the future and on social media. So In fact, my grandmother actually spent a little time at Camp Shelby as well as a nurse. She was a civilian here in town, local hospital, but would go out there to help administer vaccinations and things to troops. So, yeah, William, if you're still watching, please reach out to the museum, the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. And again, my name's Tommy Lofton. You can email me directly if you'd like to, tommylofton@matham.us, and I will do what I can to try to help you find an answer if it's possible.
And as we can all see, your website is up on the screen right now, so people can grab that URL, and I'm sure they can contact you through the museum. 11-year-old Gus asks, did any members of the 442nd move up through the ranks in their military careers after World War II?
Yes, in fact, we had quite a few who stayed on, I believe some even reached like ranks of colonel, general, and other ranks. So yes, we did have members of the 442 stay in the military and go on to fight in other wars. In fact, there's one of the few living Korea Medal of Honor recipients was at Camp Shelby as a member of the 442, and again, he didn't earn the Medal of Honor while he was in World War II. He earned it in Korea, but he continued his military service. So, and that's I think there's something admirable to that too. That there's folks who didn't just serve in World War II, get out and not return to any kind of service. There's also one notable individual, if I can sort of jump from this into that, Senator Daniel Inouye. I know someone who's very important, obviously, to the history of the National World War II Museum and to the establishment of that museum and its continuation. And he played a pivotal, or Camp Shelby, I should say, played a pivotal role in his training and preparing him for warfare. And he considered this a second home as well. In fact, he actually was our keynote speaker and cut the ribbon on the museum when it first opened back in 2001. And I believe made several trips back to Camp Shelby throughout his career in public service as a senator, many years after World War II.
W. Humphreys asked, when were Medals of Honor finally awarded, and were any still alive when they were?
Yes, there were some. I believe it was the Clinton administration, if I remember correctly. I have to almost look that up. But yes, there were Medals of Honor awarded. I believe it was 24 recipients, 21 of which were with the 442, something like that. I'm hazy on the numbers right now. But yes, there were actually some still living. Senator Inouye is one of those recipients who was still living, and sadly no longer with us. I don't know. I don't think any. No, I know that there are no living World War II Medal of Honor recipients from the 442 any longer. But I do know that the World War II Museum also has interviews with some of the last surviving members, including Senator Inouye, because I helped conduct some of them. And yeah, I would urge folks to also look at the digital collection site with the National World War II Museum to see some of those oral histories of individuals who have passed away in the last decade or so, who again served here at Camp Shelby, and talk about their time serving here and training here. And again, some of these went on to earn the Medal of Honor, or at the time earned Distinguished Service Crosses, and there was some understanding or belief that maybe some officers overseas were prejudiced and kept them from earning a Medal of Honor when they really probably should have received it. So thankfully, again, the government saw fit many years later to actually upgrade those awards from a Distinguished Service Cross to a Medal of Honor.
And as everybody can see, our digital collections website is up right now, and this is where we have over 700 oral histories online, as well as tens of thousands of photographs that can be accessed through this website. I'm going to do 2 more questions before we wrap up. Kim is asking, does the base or museum have historical documents pertaining to the 442nd's training programs or activities that are accessible there?
I'm not exactly sure I'm still new here, but I do know we're still trying to figure out our archives, what is in there. I do know we have some documentation, yes, and we do have some photographs, I believe, and other artifacts from members of the 442. We're actually hoping to digitize that stuff. It's not all readily available right now, but my goal is to get that to become more available in the near future. We have a limited staff. It's small staff, so we're all wearing a lot of hats and pulling a lot of different duties at once, but we'll get there. But we do have an exhibit, quite a large section of it actually, of our World War II exhibits on the 442, with what artifacts that we do have and photographs that we do have, including, again, some of the stories I talked about earlier, like Mr. Finch and Herb Sasaki. Some of their stories are actually in our exhibits, and you can see photographs and that kind of thing.
And do y'all have an open database to search names of people who train there?
No, we
Okay.
don't.
It's a question we get pretty regularly as well, and it's the answer is no, we don't have one either. So the last question is going to be, Sarah asks, were there Japanese American service women at Camp Shelby, because she's having a hard time finding stories on them.
I know the Japanese Americans had. I don't know if any of them or many of them were at Camp Shelby. I could find out, but I do know we had a major WAC training school there. In fact, some of the famous photographs of the WAC training programs in the World War II were actually from Camp Shelby. I'd have to look to see, honestly. I really don't know the answer. If Sarah wants to email me, I can correspond with her. I'll look into it, see what I can find out. Never be afraid to say you don't know and to do some more research. But yeah, I actually would be interested to know that as well.
All right. Well, I think we're gonna go ahead and wrap it up here, Tommy. I really appreciate you joining me today. Before we wrap this up, we'll like to let everybody know that please join us. We do these live presentations every day. Tomorrow's presentation, we'll have Doctors Keith Huxon and Ed Langle doing a presentation. And then definitely please join us on Thursday and Friday, as the museum will be connecting with the Hart Mountain Interpretive Center up in Cody, Wyoming. So this presentation should be very interesting, and I'm certainly looking forward to them. So everybody, thank y'all very much for joining us today. Everybody stay safe, and we'll see you soon.